Capitola Black Recordings presents an unabridged recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker, or A Lady of England. Chapter 10. Those Left Behind. Had Maurice been a person of importance, had his life been esteemed by much value by others, he would hardly have been suffered to remain an hour in a house which had been visited by a deadly and infectious disease. But the boy had no watchful father, no tender mother to feel anxious care on his account, and the orphan remained, unfearing and unharmed, where death had just smitten down youth and beauty in their joyous prime. Maurice wandered listlessly through the lofty and splendid apartments, scarcely realizing the truth of the awful event which had occurred. He stood in Albina's exquisite boudoir. There was her marker in the unfinished novel, her music book open on the piano. The flowers in her vase were beautiful still, while the hand that had placed them there lay stiff and cold in its shroud. Maurice instinctively listened for the rustle of her dress, the light touch of her fingers upon the piano, the well-known tones of her voice. He started when the summer breeze stirred the muslin curtains, as if it must be her hand that had softly drawn them aside. There were heavy feet moving above. The sound was painful to Maurice. Through the open window he passed out on the terrace and down into the spacious garden. Never had the parterres looked more brilliant. There was something sickening to the soul of the youth in their very brightness and beauty. The doves were cooing from the grove, the bee humming amid the blossoms, the butterfly gaily fluttering where the heliotrope scented the air. To think, thou that shouldst die and life be left to the butterfly, was the feeling that swelled the heart of Maurice. The youth saw nothing of his uncle during the weary days that preceded the funeral. He only received a message from Sir John, desiring him to open and answer any letters that might arrive at the Hall. The task was one of the most difficult and painful that could have been inflicted on Maurice. He hated the sight of the post-bag, heavy with letters, black-edged and black-sealed, containing tender condolences, anxious inquiries, and sympathy with the father's grief expressed in every form and style. Friends bade the bereaved baronet take comfort from remembering the virtues of his now sainted child, the sweet blossom too lovely for earth, all angel now, and little less below. Maurice sat resting his aching brow on his hand, the ink drying on his suspended pen, as he attempted, feelingly yet without violating truth, to answer such letters as these. Might not friends be right after all? Might not harmlessness be counted as holiness, the buried talent bring a heavenly blessing? Alas! Maurice could discover no scripture warrant for believing that living for self and the world can lead to the enjoyment of heavenly delights. The day of the funeral arrived. Sir John did not attend the mournful ceremony. Lord George had been expected at the Hall, but in a letter, full of strong expressions of grief and despair, the bereaved bridegroom described himself as too ill to undertake the journey to Surrey. "It is not illness, but the fear of it, as keeps him away," said the indignant Mrs. Wells, when she heard of the excuse. "The young lord has no mind to put himself in the way of the fever. Take my word for it, he'll be married before the year is over." Nothing that could give solemnity to funeral pomp was omitted when the mortal remains of Albina were carried to the family vault. There were the stately hearse, the nodding plumes, the velvet pall fringed with snowy white, the long line of empty carriages, for Grandmont Hall was sufficiently near to London to enable many a friend and acquaintance to pay an ordinary mark of respect to the dead, to gratify the feelings of the living. Slowly wound the melancholy procession along the beautiful carriage drive, under the waving boughs of the trees rich with their summer foliage. The deer in the park stood at a distance to gaze. The rooks rose heavily on the wing, as scared by a sight so unusual. A crowd had collected at the gate by the lodge, but though many a murmured word of pity for the poor young lady was spoken, not one in the crowd could weep as for the loss of a benefactress, whose smile would be missed, whose kind counsels remembered in cottage homes where she had scattered blessings. Maurice followed the hearse, a sad and solitary mourner. His heart bled for his uncle, the now childless and joyless man, whom grief had disabled even from attending the funeral of his only daughter. Sir John, however, appeared on the following morning at the breakfast table. His hair was, perhaps, a little greyer, his voice a little more nervous than usual, but otherwise there was nothing to mark the week of suffering through which he had passed. To the surprise of his nephew, the baronet began at once to converse upon the weather, the crops, the school examination, anything, everything but the subject which must have lain nearest to his heart. All reference to the past was avoided. No word of sympathy would have been endured. Even its tone would have given annoyance. How differently, thought Maurice, sorrow works in different hearts. Yes, some receive sorrow as God's angel, listen with meek submission to the message that he bears, prepare the sacrifice required in his presence, and as he disappears in the incense of their prayers, find that he has left a blessing behind him. Others make an idol of their sorrow, enshrine it in the depths of their hearts, close their ears to the voice of consolation, and mourn even as those without hope. Others, and such are mostly those of worldly and selfish spirit, receive sorrow as a natural enemy, to be struggled with, wrestled down, thrust out of sight. And of those was the father of Albina. Maurice noted that his uncle now lingered longer over his wine, filled his glass fuller, and filled it more often. The soul that is not elevated and purified by grief is too frequently debased and hardened. Maurice Somers soon discovered that the death of his cousin had materially altered his own position at Grandmont Hall. He was now the nearest relation of his uncle living, and might be considered his natural heir. Not that a single acre of Sir John's property was entailed, and his title could only be inherited by his own immediate descendants, but it was probable that the baronet would adopt his sister's son as his own, and that his large fortune would, in course of time, descend to Maurice Somers. Sir John had no other near connection except Mr. Glyden, a cousin in India, with whom he had never corresponded. Maurice, therefore, instead of being regarded as a poor relation, a dependent orphan, began to be looked upon as the future master of Grandmont Hall. The manner of the household changed towards him. He was treated with greater respect. His wishes were consulted. His opinion asked. The acquaintances, who had hitherto treated the youth as a cipher unworthy of notice, began to discover in him the highest qualities both of person and of mind. It was well, perhaps, for Maurice, when the midsummer vacation was over, and he returned to his class and his cricket again. Thank you for listening to Capitola Black Recordings. I hope you have enjoyed this recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker.